Welcome back to another Virtuality versus Reality video. I'm Pliskin, and today we're going to be talking about digital and non-digital optics for guns. Straight out of the factory, most guns tend to come with iron sights. Iron sights are fixtures on the top of your gun that allow you to aim at whatever it is you're firing. The basic principle behind operating your sights is aligning a fixture towards the front between fixtures more so towards the back of the gun. Lining these fixtures up together, also known as lining up your sights, allows you to get more accurate shots on target. For the longest time, this is generally how people used guns and aimed them. Then towards the mid-1800s, some guy thought it would be a great idea to put a telescope on a gun, and guess what? There was. It allowed the shooter to see further, and with markings and modifications to telescopes to better suit whatever gun it was being put on, allowed the shooter to be accurate at places or at ranges that otherwise would have been impossible with iron sights. These objects or these sights are what eventually became known as scopes. While scopes are normally attributed to sniper rifles, you can technically put a scope on any kind of gun and increase its range drastically. As long as your intention is long-range firefights or marksmanship, a scope will do you well. Although a scope will do wonders for your accuracy, it does make your gun a lot more cumbersome, heavier, and harder to deal with at closer ranges. And as such, for the longest time, the only time you would see a optic or scope or something to enhance one's vision and aim with a gun would be at longer ranges, and iron sights became the status quo for close to mid-range firefights. However, once we got to the 1980s, people began to experiment. We wanted to see if there was a better way to aim our guns than using the iron sights, because although they get the job done, they can be quite limiting. And keeping your gun on target while firing with iron sights takes a lot of training and can be difficult. It was at this point that someone had the idea to put laser pointers on the bottom of a gun to show where your gun is generally aiming at. This allows you to not even have to use the iron sights and instead just point, see where the laser is, and shoot. And as long as you aim in the general direction of the laser, that's where you're going to hit. This was good, but it wasn't really practical in military or a lot of police settings as it gives away your position. A red laser showing exactly where the shooter is coming from is more dangerous to the shooter than just having to take his time and learn how to use his iron sights. In a gunfight, once you're seen, your chances of coming out alive diminish greatly. So having this red laser make your aim easier, yeah, it was great, but it was kind of a double-edged sword, as now everyone knew where you were coming from. So while everyone in the gun industry went through a phase with laser pointers, eventually back to iron sights it was. And it remained this way until 2008, when an overlooked form of technology finally got its time in the spotlight. While everyone was too busy focusing on scopes and laser sights, someone in Sweden back in 1975 came up with the idea of having a digital dot mark the target for you. This form of optic was called the red dot sight. Coming back to 2008, this was a time when the US military was considering changing out its M4 for a more modern rifle. Many of the modern rifles that were entered into the challenge to replace the US military's standard issue rifle featured some sort of digital optic built into the gun. This caught everyone's attention. It became clear that shooters using a dot optic were much quicker and accurate than shooters using iron sights or some other supplementary form of aiming. And it was this realization that brings us to where we are today, where optics are one of the most heated, controversial, and focused on aspects of the gun world. So now that we have a recap of how these digital optics came to be and how they became so prevalent, let's start talking about them, specifically how they work and the pros and cons of using them. There are many different kinds of optics, and going over every single one of them and their functionality would be a pain in my ass. So because of that, I'm going to give a gross oversimplification on the basics of how an optic works. Basically, optics are battery-driven digital systems that enhance your vision by projecting a small dot onto a screen telling you where your shots are going to land. Now, optics, when you first buy them, given the gun you're going to put them on, need to be zeroed. It's kind of like, how do I explain zeroing? If you've ever tuned a guitar, so when you pick up a guitar, normally you have to tune the strings by pulling these little latches on the side until it sounds right. Zeroing is a similar process, in which you put the optic on the gun and you do a little bit of trial and error work until you get the optic tuned up to be accurate to where you're shooting. So when you see people in video games pick up random guns with optics on them and start shooting them, odds are it's going to take a little getting used to, as each optic is tuned specifically for a given shooter. Optics are usually set at a certain type of magnification, 1 times, 2 times, so and so. However, some optics can actually shift between different magnifications, going from a 1 times optic to a 6 times optic, making optics applicable even for sniping and marksmanship scenarios, and not just short to mid-range combat. Essentially, you can set up an optic or buy an optic for any sort of situation you might find yourself in, making them extremely versatile. Some optics even enhance our vision by allowing us to see other light spectrums, for example, infrared. Infrared optics are particularly useful for sniping in environments that are dark or where enemies might be concealing themselves too well for the naked eye to see. So optics can enhance our vision not just by how far we can see, but in what light spectrum we can see. Optics are just great. They allow us to aim more accurately, get a clear sight picture even when we're firing repeated shots. They allow us to tune them for our personalized usage, whereas iron sights just force you to use whatever came out of the factory. They allow you to see on other light spectrums. You can switch between different magnifications. Some optics even work with night vision goggles, so if you're using a night vision set of goggles, you can't normally use your iron sights as you're not really seeing out of your eyes, you're seeing out of the goggles. So optics allow you to adjust them so you could look through your optic as if you were aiming with your naked eye. Optics are also useful for people that have an eye stigmatism, that can't really see a clear picture with their iron sights. It's much easier for someone who's impaired to see a clear red dot where they're aiming. Militaries now focus more on developing their optics than their guns, because now many projects are in place to create optics that adjust for different elevations, they adjust for wind, they essentially do all of the aiming for you. We live in a world where it's no longer who has the better gun, but instead, who has the better optic that allows them to push their own biological limits above and beyond. At this point, you might be thinking, Pliskin, optics sound amazing. What are the downsides? Is there any, are they not completely superior than any other form of sights? And to that I say, yes. Yes, they are superior. You can put them on pistols, rifles, shotguns. Yes, I said shotguns. Sights on shotguns are underrated, and I recommend if you have a shotgun to throw an optic on there. Optics are the future, without a doubt. Still, I feel like this video would be unbalanced if I just gushed about optics instead of telling you about some of the downsides or at least some of the arguments against optics. So with that being said, here's a list form of some of the downsides to optics. Number 1. Optics tend to be a lot more delicate and less rugged than your actual weapon system. A lot of work has to go into maintaining your optics, making sure they don't get scratched up or broken. For example, if you're in a tundra environment, you need to make sure you have some covers for your optics so that they don't freeze over and break. You can't really take them underwater because again, they're electrical. Anything that's electrical with a battery, like would you throw your phone into water? No. Same thing here. So there are environments that might prove too harsh for optics. Number 2. There's an argument for being too reliant on your optic. Many people believe that if you're too used to shooting your optic and having all the advantages that it brings, that if it ever fails, you'd be useless with the gun in your hand. To that I say, yeah? If you just practice with your gun and its iron sights, get used to it, know your weapon system, and then use an optic with it on top of it, you would be good to go. Essentially, think of your optic as an enhancement to your skill set, not a crutch that you rely on. Whatever gun you're using, ensure that you know how it works without any sort of optics or modifications. And as long as you're comfortable with that weapon system on its own, an optic is just going to make you stronger. And if it ever breaks down, you're going to be good to go. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Those are all the downsides I see to using optics, or the valid arguments that I've heard. With that being said, let's look at some good examples and bad examples of realistic portrayals of optics in video games just to finish this video off. First up, let's talk about Resident Evil 4 and its usage of laser sights. Now, we talked about the issues of laser sights before, and you wouldn't ever really see anyone using them in a practical setting. However, within the context of Resident Evil 4's development and having an immersive way to aim, laser sights make sense for the game. They still hadn't really figured out how to do third-person controls. In fact, they pioneered them. So what they're working with there, it was a cool idea to use them like immersively to keep you like in the game and not have some magical floating crosshair. But at the same time, you wouldn't really see that. Especially some of the guns in the game where the laser optic is on top, like clouding the iron sights. That's just a stupid thing to do and would make your gun useless. Call of Duty usually portrays like a lot of these old-timey guns, for example like Cold War era weaponry, with having optics and adjustments and all this kind of shit. Basically in the 80s, 70s, and 60s, customizing your rifle meant giving it a paint job. You would not see Alex Mason or Woods walking around with like a holographic sight on an AK. That just wouldn't happen. In fact, a lot of guns made during that time don't really work well with optics today and are quite awkward and cumbersome. For example, take the F1 FAMAS. It has this huge carrying handle, so when you mount an optic on that, the optic is raised at an uncomfortable and weird position and takes a lot of getting used to. So the guns back then weren't made with optics in mind, and you didn't really see anyone using optics. Not until like the late 90s, early 2000s. Another thing I need to pick at is a lot of games, but specifically Far Cry's usage of like unshielded optics. Like you will find optics that are kind of open and thin like this in the world. However, most of the time, especially in the harsh environments of like Kirat or the Rook Islands, you'd want an optic that's properly covered and shielded, more in like a scope shape instead of that like flat surface that you would normally aim with, that you'd see like in older Call of Duty multiplayer games. But yeah, besides that, those are all the bones I have to pick with optics and their portrayal. It's just a matter of games not really understanding the time period or not caring about the time period, or just featuring things that don't make sense just because they're cool or immersive. But yeah, that's all for me, guys. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Virtuality versus Reality. If you learned something, leave a like, subscribe. If I got something wrong about the history of optics, or you have something you want to share that you feel I glossed over too much, by all means, hit me up in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys on the next video. This has been Pliskin.